Have you ever wondered what would happen if we could sit down with Padre Pio and ask him, what should a Catholic never accept in this life? Imagine just for a moment sitting across from him, his piercing eyes filled with both suffering and divine peace. You hear the rustle of his habit as he turns to you and whispers something that shakes you. There are 5 things no true Christian should ever tolerate, but most people ignore them. In fact, they don't even realize. He warned us, this isn't just a fantasy. Padre Pio, one of the most revered and mystically gifted saints of the 20th century, was known for his brutal honesty when it came to matters of the soul. He wasn't interested in modern comforts or soft teachings. He spoke with the fire of heaven and the clarity of someone who could see what was hidden from human eyes. And yet, even with all the miracles, bilocations, and confessions that lasted 16 hours a day, most of his spiritual warnings have been forgotten, or worse, ignored. Here's something that might surprise you. In hundreds of letters to his spiritual children, Padre Pio repeatedly pointed out behaviors and attitudes that, if left unchecked, could lead souls to ruin. He didn't speak in generalities. He was specific, direct, uncompromising. But today, over 90% of Catholics have never even read his words. Instead, we live in a time where sin is rebranded as personal truth. Silence is considered prudence, and even the Eucharist is received without reverence or preparation. Why does this matter? Because these forgotten teachings hold the power to protect your soul. They're not outdated opinions of a past century. They are timeless truths born from Padre Pio's deep union with God and his mission to snatch souls from damnation. And when we ignore them, we don't just lose pious traditions, we risk spiritual blindness, lukewarm faith, and separation from divine grace. So, what exactly are these 5 things Padre Pio said you should never accept? That's what this video is all about. Over the next few minutes, we're going to uncover them one by one, not as a list of rules, but as a call to courage. A call to remember that the path to heaven has always been narrow, and that truth is never comfortable, but always necessary. Are you ready to rediscover what the Church has forgotten? Let's begin, and let Padre Pio speak for himself. The first thing Padre Pio warned us to never accept was sin as something normal. It may sound obvious, but today this is precisely what's happening. In modern society, sin is no longer called by its name. It is disguised as personal choice, freedom, or living your truth. But for Padre Pio, there was no compromise with evil, no gray areas. He once said with chilling conviction, "It is better to die than to sin." That wasn't poetic exaggeration. He meant it literally. For Padre Pio, sin, especially mortal sin, was not just a mistake. It was a spiritual death. He saw it every day in the confessional, often telling penitents that the true illness of our time was not cancer, poverty, or war. It was the soul's indifference to sin. Let's look at the backdrop. Padre Pio lived from 1887 to 1968, a time when both world wars shook the faith of many and secularism began spreading rapidly across Europe. The rise of ideologies like Marxism and relativism led millions to abandon moral absolutes. In Italy, the post-war boom of the 1950s brought not just economic growth, but a creeping normalization of luxury, vanity, and spiritual apathy. During these decades, Padre Pio became a living contradiction to this trend. He spent over 50 years bearing the stigmata, the visible wounds of Christ, and hearing up to 25,000 confessions a year. He often cried after confessions, not because of the sins themselves, but because of how lightly they were taken. For him, calling sin normal was the fastest path to eternal separation from God. A powerful example comes from an account in 1957 when a young man confessed living with his girlfriend outside of marriage. When Padre Pio asked if they were married in the church, the man shrugged and said, "It's just how things are today." Padre Pio immediately stopped the confession and said, "God's laws do not change with the times." He then asked the man to return only when he was ready to choose holiness over habit. What makes this even more urgent today is the cultural climate. A 2021 global Catholic survey by CARA, Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, showed that over 60% of practicing Catholics no longer believe in mortal sin as a real category. That means more than half the faithful don't recognize when they are spiritually at risk. Padre Pio knew that the devil's greatest weapon wasn't violence or temptation. It was convincing people that sin is harmless. But once sin becomes normal, grace loses its urgency. That's why his message rings louder than ever. Never accept sin as part of your identity. It is not who you are. It is what you must overcome. Not every piece of advice is good advice. Padre Pio knew this better than most. He once warned, "If a word, a book, or a friend makes you question the truths of your faith, do not follow it, run from it." In a world overflowing with opinions, influencers, and self-proclaimed spiritual gurus, this warning feels more relevant than ever. Today, many people confuse popularity with wisdom. They turn to online figures, celebrities, or even well-meaning friends for guidance on love, morality, and identity. But here's the danger. When the voice you follow contradicts the voice of Christ and His Church, you're not being led. You're being misled. Padre Pio was clear about this. He taught that any advice, no matter how kind it may sound, becomes poisonous when it distances you from prayer, the sacraments, or the commandments. This problem isn't new. In the 1960s, during the final years of Padre Pio's life, cultural shifts encouraged Catholics to embrace new, progressive values. The sexual revolution was gaining momentum, and relativism, the belief that truth changes with opinion, began to spread inside and outside the Church. Many were seduced by modern philosophies that promised freedom without sacrifice, truth without responsibility, and spirituality without Christ. Padre Pio saw these dangers coming. He frequently told his spiritual children to guard their ears and hearts. He once refused to bless a book a penitent had brought him, saying, "This book may speak of light, but it comes from darkness." For him, even intellectual curiosity could be spiritually deadly if it opened the door to heresy or doubt. What exactly does bad advice look like today? It can be a friend saying, "Follow your heart, even if it goes against what you believe," or a podcast host mocking the Church's teachings on sexuality. It can be a self-help book claiming you don't need religion to be spiritual, or a therapist who says your guilt is just a religious illusion. These voices are everywhere, and they often sound compassionate, but their effect is subtle. They chip away at your trust in God's truth. A 2022 study from the Catholic Institute of Faith and Culture showed that over 55% of young adult Catholics have followed advice that directly contradicted church teaching, believing it to be more realistic. That's not a failure of information. It's a failure of formation. Padre Pio's solution: stay close to the Church, listen to confessors and spiritual directors who walk in truth, read scripture and lives of saints, and above all, never accept advice that calls you away from the Eucharist, the cross, or the Virgin Mary, because any path that leads you away from them does not lead to heaven. One of the most serious spiritual warnings Padre Pio ever gave was this: receiving Holy Communion without being in the state of grace is like drinking poison. Strong words, but he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He understood, through both divine insight and countless hours in the confessional, that the Eucharist is not just a symbol or a ritual, it is Christ Himself. And to approach Him with a soul stained by mortal sin is to commit a second offense, worse than the first. Let's be clear, mortal sin, by its very nature, severs our relationship with God. According to church teaching, for someone to be in a state of mortal sin, 3 conditions must be met. The sin must be grave. The person must know it's wrong and still choose to do it. Common examples include deliberately missing Sunday Mass, engaging in sexual relations outside of marriage, watching pornography, or harboring deep hatred without repentance. Padre Pio's time in the confessional made one truth painfully obvious. To him, many Catholics receive communion out of routine or social pressure without having made a sincere confession, and he wasn't afraid to say so. One of his spiritual daughters once approached the altar for communion, and he paused. With great love but unshakable firmness, he asked, "Have you been to confession?" When she replied, "No, Father, but it's been only a few weeks," he shook his head and said, "Even one mortal sin makes the soul unworthy. Go reconcile with God first." In 1 Corinthians 11:27-29, St. Paul already warned the early church, "Whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord." This isn't about legalism or fear. It's about reverence, about recognizing that communion is not just something we do at Mass. It's the most intimate union with Jesus possible on earth. It requires preparation. It demands honesty with ourselves. What's shocking is how widespread this issue has become. A 2023 Catholic Voices survey in Europe revealed that nearly 70% of Catholics under 40 receive communion regularly, yet only 20% go to confession at least once a year. This gap points to a dangerous misunderstanding that God is love, yes, but not justice, that He is mercy, but not truth. Padre Pio never separated mercy from accountability. He heard confessions with patience, but never sugar-coated sin. For him, the worst tragedy was not the sin itself, but when a soul refused to admit it needed forgiveness. The Eucharist is a medicine for the holy, not a mask for the guilty. So his message remains: don't play with grace, don't receive the sacred host with a stained heart. Clean it first through true confession, and only then approach the altar with awe and love. Padre Pio didn't just love the Virgin Mary, he lived for her. From his earliest childhood, he was deeply devoted to the Mother of God, calling her his heavenly confidant, and often saying, "I owe everything to Our Lady." For him, Mary was not optional in the spiritual life. She was essential. That's why, to Padre Pio, any offense against her, whether through blasphemy, mockery, or even indifference, was intolerable. He once declared with unmistakable seriousness, "Woe to those who insult the Madonna. Her heart bleeds for every soul that turns its back on her." This wasn't emotional exaggeration. It was a theological truth rooted in his mystical experiences. Padre Pio believed, and the Church confirms, that Mary plays a unique role in the salvation of souls. To reject her, or to speak lightly of her, is to reject a gift God Himself has given us. Why does this matter today? Because modern culture has all but erased reverence for Mary. In some places, she's mocked as a relic of superstition. In others, she's seen merely as a historical figure with no relevance to our lives. Worse, some Catholics now view devotion to Mary as outdated or excessive, despite centuries of church teaching affirming her role as mediatrix, advocate, and Queen of Heaven. Padre Pio saw this danger rising even in his time. In a 1958 letter, he wrote, "Our Lady is being forgotten by many of her children. They no longer pray the rosary. They no longer speak her name, but hell trembles at the sound of Maria." For him, the rosary wasn't just a devotional. In practice, it was a spiritual weapon, one he used daily, often praying more than 5 full rosaries every day, even while suffering intensely. Stories abound of Padre Pio scolding those who dismissed Marian devotion. On one occasion, a young man told him, "I pray to Jesus directly. I don't see the need for Mary." Padre Pio responded firmly. Then you've misunderstood the heart of the gospel. Jesus came to us through her. Why would you think you can bypass her now? And there's more. In 1917, the same year as the apparitions of Fatima, Padre Pio began experiencing intense interior suffering whenever Mary was insulted. He called these spiritual wounds hidden sorrows and said they were often heavier than physical pain. It was as if, in some mysterious way, he shared in the sorrow of the Mother of Sorrows. So his message is timeless and clear. Never accept silence when Mary is dishonored. Speak up when her purity, obedience, or motherhood are attacked. Pray the Rosary daily, not as a habit, but as an act of love and reparation. For where Mary is defended, Christ is glorified. And where she's rejected, hearts grow cold. What you've just heard isn't a list of strict rules or outdated opinions. It's a lifeline. Padre Pio didn't warn us about these 5 dangers to control us or scare us. He did it because he loved souls more than comfort, more than popularity, more than his own peace. He suffered, bled, and prayed day and night so that people like you and me wouldn't fall asleep spiritually. And yet here we are, living in a time when everything he warned us about is not only accepted, but celebrated. Sin is normalized. Faith is questioned. The Eucharist is received casually. The Virgin Mary is forgotten, and the voices of truth are drowned out by noise and novelty. But you don't have to follow that path. You can choose something better, something eternal. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If we keep accepting what Padre Pio told us to reject, we won't just lose touch with tradition, we'll lose the battle for our own souls. Because this isn't just about habits or practices. This is about salvation. And salvation isn't something we stumble into by accident. It's a choice, a daily fight, a radical rejection of everything that tries to separate us from God. Padre Pio didn't live a comfortable life. He didn't preach what people wanted to hear, but that's exactly why his message still has power, because it cuts through the fog of compromise and reminds us the gospel doesn't bend to our preferences, it calls us to rise. So now it's your turn to respond. You've heard the truth, you've seen the warnings, you've felt the urgency. What will you do with it? Will you keep living like everyone else, accepting the lies that keep souls lukewarm and blind? Or will you take a stand, starting today, and begin walking the narrow road, the one paved with grace, truth, and courage? If this video opened your eyes, even just a little, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel so that you never miss the teachings that lead to heaven. Click like if Padre Pio's words touched your heart. Leave a comment sharing which of the 5 warnings impacted you the most. Your testimony may help someone else. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth, especially those who have drifted away from the faith. Because in the end, it's not about views or followers. It's about saving souls. And Padre Pio's voice still echoes from eternity. Stay with God and don't accept anything that leads you away from Him.